The Dining-Room Fireplace by R.H. Malden and read by Christopher Halton. Good evening and welcome back. Tonight's story is The Dining-Room Fireplace by R.H. Malden, the Anglican clergyman, classical scholar and ghost story writer, often regarded as one of the closest literary successors to M.R. James. Like James, Malden drew upon a world of old houses, ancient traditions, and the quiet persistence of the past, weaving tales in which the supernatural intrudes almost imperceptibly into everyday life. In this story, what begins as an apparently ordinary feature of an old country house, a handsome fireplace in a long-established dining room, gradually reveals itself to be connected with events best forgotten. As so often in the finest classic ghost stories, the terror does not come from violence or spectacle, but from suggestion, atmosphere, and the dreadful possibility that some ancient wrong has left its mark upon the stones themselves. As with many works of its period, some of the language and attitudes reflect the time in which it was written and are presented here in their original historical context. So settle back, lower the lights, and join me for The Dining-Room Fireplace by R.H. Malden. Anyone who knows the neighbourhood of Dublin will remember the good-sized country houses in which it abounds. Most of them date from the 18th century, when Irish landowners were prosperous and labour was cheap. Some of them incorporate bits of older buildings which may have begun life as castles of the Pale. Most of them are now in a state of dilapidation which is not unpicturesque, though it would be out of place in England. Perhaps I ought to have used the past tense. I do not know how many of them have survived the establishment of Ayr, or whatever that part of Ireland chooses to call itself nowadays, and I do not feel tempted to go and see. I am writing of things as they were during the closing years of the reign of Queen Victoria. It was during a visit to one of them in the autumn of the year 1899 that the experience, I can hardly dignify it by the name of adventure, which I am about to relate befell me. It belonged to a family named Moore who had inhabited it for several generations. The present owner was a young man, unmarried and in the army. Naturally, he could not spend much of his time there and was glad to let it when he could. It had been taken for one summer by some cousins of mine who lived in Dublin, and it was on their invitation that I was there. I need not try your patience by attempting to describe it in detail. There was nothing very noteworthy about it, except an almost ruinous tower at the northwest angle. This was obviously much older than the rest of the house, and we young people thought it ought to contain a ghost. We could not, however, hear of any story to that effect. We explored it pretty thoroughly, but found nothing more exciting than a very large quantity of dust and a few bats. We went there once late on a moonlight evening, but even then could not pretend that we saw or heard anything unusual. The south side of the house consisted of 3 large rooms, a drawing room at the western end, then a dining room opening out of it, and lastly a billiard room which was also used as a gun room. Probably, in fact, it had been built as a gun room, and the billiard table had been added afterwards. It had a door leading into the garden, but there was no access to it from the house, except from the dining room. The dining room was hung with portraits of bygone Moors, who had no doubt played their several parts adequately in their generation. But none of them had reached fame, and the pictures were of no outstanding artistic merit. The collection as a whole looked well enough, but was not likely to be of much interest, except to members of the family. One picture there was, however, which did arouse our curiosity. It represented a man of about 30. There was no name or date upon the frame, but the dress was that of the closing years of the 18th century. The most remarkable thing about it was the attitude which the sitter had chosen to adopt. He was astride of a chair with his arms folded and resting on the top rail. His back was towards the spectator so that his features would have been invisible if he had not been looking over his left shoulder. His face, so far as it could be seen, did not resemble a Moor. The upper part suggested considerable intellectual power. The lower part was not pleasant. The whole effect was formidable and bespoke a man who would be a very dangerous enemy. The execution was not particularly good. In fact, the technique suggested an amateur. But it was impossible not to feel that the artist had caught the likeness of his original well, and difficult not to regret that he had done so. We wondered why such a curious picture, which did not look like a family portrait, should be displayed so conspicuously. It looked as if there must be a story of some sort about it. A few days later, Captain Moore called. He was stationed at the Curragh, and having some business to transact in Dublin very civilly, looked in to ask after his tenant's comfort. We ventured to put a question about the curious portrait. "Yes," he said, "it's a fantastic thing, isn't it? Clever in a way, though, and I should think a good likeness. But I don't know who it is any more than you do. It isn't one of the family. You'd guess that, I hope, by looking at it. All I know about it is that my great-grandfather, the old boy over there," here he pointed to a portrait of the same period which hung exactly opposite on the other side of the room, "stuck it up about the time of the Union. I rather think he painted it himself. Anyhow, he was so keen about it that he left directions in his will that it was never to be moved. So there it's been ever since. I expect there is a story if I knew what it was. I believe my great-grandfather had been pretty wild in his young days. A lot of his generation were dazzled by the French Revolution, you know. I dare say it looked better at a distance than at close quarters. But while he was still pretty young, about the turn of the century, I think, he turned over a new leaf. Model country gentleman, magistrate, churchwarden, all that sort of thing, you know, and I believe a really good man into the bargain, very charitable and so on. Not very hospitable, though, by all accounts. In fact, during the last years of his life, when he was a widower, he would hardly see anybody, and I believe was nicknamed the Hermit. I remember once, when I was a little chap, about 6, I think, I was playing in the dining room on a winter afternoon. I think the nursery chimney was being swept. Anyhow, I had been sent downstairs for some reason. It was getting dark, and something gave me a terrible fright. The funny thing was that I couldn't say what it was, and I don't know now, but I think it was something to do with that picture. I ran screaming into the drawing room where my mother was, and though I couldn't tell her what was the matter, I'm sure that she thought it was that. When I had been comforted, my father came in. He had been out shooting, I think, and she began to talk to him very earnestly. I wasn't meant to hear, and don't suppose I should have understood much if I had, but I do recollect that she said something to the effect that it couldn't go on, and that it wasn't as if this were the first time. And he said that he couldn't do whatever it was she wanted him to do. I suppose now she was asking him to have the picture moved, or perhaps to get rid of it outright, and he was reminding her of the clause in his grandfather's will. Of course, 99 women out of 100 would see no reason why the wishes of someone who had been dead for more than 50 years should be allowed to interfere with their own. Anyhow, that was the nearest approach to a quarrel which my father and mother ever had that I can remember, and the picture stopped in its place, as you see. I once asked him about it. He looked very grave and was silent for a minute or two, as if he were making up his mind about something. Then he said, "I'll tell you what I know about it some day, but not just now. You must wait until you're older." And I had to be content with that. Both he and my mother died soon afterwards, and I went to live with an uncle on her side. My father had been an only son, and the house was shut up for several years. So I never heard the story, whatever it may be. I expect old Barton at the lodge knows something about it. He's been on the place all his life, and his father and grandfather before him. But I'm pretty sure he wouldn't tell anybody if he did know. After Captain Moore had gone, I went and examined the picture more closely than I had ever done before. I came to the conclusion that it was a cleverer thing and a more repulsive subject than I had thought at first. One thing perplexed me very much. I tried to put myself into the position of the sitter and found that I could not twist my head round as far as his. His chin was almost on his left shoulder. Why had he chosen to be painted in such an unnatural and indeed as it seemed impossible attitude? And how had he contrived to sit for it? I don't think the expression rubberneck, which I believe to be American for sightseer, had been coined then, or if it had, it hadn't crossed the Atlantic, but I can think of no one to whom it would be more appropriate. A day or two afterwards I happened to see Barton in his garden, and thought I would try whether there was anything to be got out of him. Like all his kind, his conversational powers were remarkable, and he was never unwilling to exercise them. Eventually I got him onto the pictures in the house, and I thought that he seemed to feel that he was being drawn towards thin ice. How would the like of him know anything about them, or photographs either? Sure, I must ask the young master about them, and wasn't he in the house only last week? I recognised that Captain Moore's estimate of him as a source of information on this point had been accurate. A few nights afterwards, when we were all in the drawing-room after dinner, I had occasion to go to the billiard-room to fetch a book which I had left there. Dinner had been cleared away, so I took a candle to light me through the deserted dining-room. Just as I was passing the fireplace, I was conscious of so strong a draught that my candle guttered and was nearly blown out. I supposed it was a down-draught due to the large size of the chimney, and to the fact that there was no fire in the grate, and rather wondered that we had never noticed it before. It was not a windy night, so that if there were a strong draught now, one would suppose that it was a permanent feature of the room, and that whoever sat on that side of the table would want a screen behind his chair. But hitherto no one had made any complaint. On my way back I was surprised to find the draught equally strong in the opposite direction. It was now sucking inwards towards the fireplace. I held my candle high, shielding it with the other hand, and looked round to see if there were an open window. But the windows were all securely shuttered, and the doors at each end of the room were shut. I could not account for any draught, much less for one which apparently changed its direction, almost as if it were due to the slow breathing of some gigantic creature crouching in the fireplace. While I stood there, the inward draught suddenly ceased. After a moment's stillness there came an outward puff, really strong enough to be called a gust, which blew my candle out. This was too much. I groped my way to the end of the room as quickly as I could without stopping to light a match. Once out of the room, I felt rather ashamed of myself for having been so easily scared. I suppose that was why I did not feel inclined to say anything about what had happened. Probably I said to myself there was really more wind outside than I had imagined, and of course a rambling old house was likely to be full of unaccountable draughts. Most likely this one depended upon the wind being exactly in one quarter, which was why we had not noticed it before, and more to the same effect. But I did not find this cogent reasoning convincing. When I went to bed, I looked out, and everything seemed to be perfectly still. This, I was bound to admit, was as I had expected. 3 nights later, I had a curious dream. I dreamed that I was in the dining room, and that the figure over the mantelpiece had come down from his frame. He was seated astride of a chair as he was painted, almost in the fireplace. His back was turned to the room, but instead of having his head upon his shoulder, it was turned away so that nothing could be seen of his features. He appeared to be speaking with great earnestness to an invisible personage who must have been stationed a few feet up the chimney. I could not catch what he was saying, for he spoke very rapidly, but his tones were those of a person in deep distress. When he had finished speaking, there came a rumbling, moaning noise in the chimney, such as is made by the wind on stormy nights. This presently began to shape itself into words. At first they were not at all distinct, but gradually they became clearer, though they seemed to be in a language unknown to me. I wondered whether it could be Irish. The voice spoke very deliberately, with a cold malignity of tone which made me feel very thankful that I could not follow what it was saying. There was something indescribably evil about it. It was the most unpleasant sound to which I have ever listened, asleep or awake. If fear can make the hair stand on end, I must have resembled a clothes brush. At this point I woke, and it was more in obedience to some automatic instinct than to any reasoned courage that I decided to visit the dining room. I do not know what, if anything, I expected to see. As I opened the door, there was a grating sound, as if a chair were being hastily dragged across the uncarpeted part of the floor. But I told myself that that was caused by rats. The house abounded in them, and everyone knows that they can make extraordinary noises. I suspect that they are at the bottom of a great many ghost stories. I advanced to the fireplace, but beyond the fact that the hearthrug was curiously bundled up into a heap, a circumstance which did not for some reason strike me at the moment, though I wondered about it afterwards, there was nothing in the least unusual to be seen. My candle burned quite steadily as I held it high and looked round the silent, empty room. I stared up at the odd, forbidding picture above the mantelpiece, but there did not seem to be anything to be got out of him. Upon the whole, I was glad of that, for he did not look like the sort of person I should have chosen for a midnight tete-a-tete. "Well," I said aloud, addressing the portrait, "I wish I knew rather more about you, but as you aren't in a position to explain yourself, I shall go back to bed." I did so and slept soundly for the rest of the night. Next morning I did not mention my dream to anyone else. Perhaps I was a little ashamed of it. Also, the walls of Irish houses have even acuter ears than those elsewhere, and I did not wish to be responsible for an outbreak of hysteria among the servants. It so happened that I had no occasion to be in the dining room alone after dark during the next day or two. Perhaps I was at pains not to be. No one commented upon the curious draught which I had noticed. Indeed, I do not think it was perceptible in the daytime. My dreams, when I had any, were, as usual, entirely commonplace. One evening, when my visit was nearly at an end, one of my cousins and I were sitting talking in the billiard room after the rest of the family had gone to bed. Our conversation turned on ghosts and apparitions of various kinds, a subject in which we both took a keen, if sceptical, interest. Dreams and their value, this was before the days of psychoanalysis, and the possibility of their coming true were also discussed, and it was past midnight when we got up to go to bed. We then found that there were no bedroom candles for us. Presumably they had been left in the dining room or in the hall beyond it. The oil lamp by which we were sitting was too big and heavy to take with us. As it was past the middle of September, and the day had been wet, we had had fires in the sitting rooms. The dining room fire had been burning brightly when we finished dinner, so that it was probable that there would still be enough of it left to prevent our passage through the room from offering any insurmountable obstacles. So we put the lamp out and prepared to go. As soon as we opened the door, we saw that our surmise had been correct. There was a sufficient glow in the fireplace to light us down the room, but we had hardly taken a step before we were startled by a rapid thudding sound, such as might be produced by a big dog beating his tail upon the floor. There was a dog about the place, but at night he had his own quarters in the stable yard. Even if he had not been put to bed then properly, as might very well be the case in a household of Irish servants, he had certainly not been in the dining room during dinner, and could hardly have got there since. The thudding ceased as suddenly as it had begun, but next moment we were even more startled by seeing the fire beginning to disappear. I remembered a story which I had once read, by H.G. Wells, I think. In it the lights in a haunted room go out one by one, and as the occupant rushes to the fire to rekindle them, that too dies away into absolute blackness. But we soon saw that our fire was not going out like that. It was being obscured by some large dark object which was rising from the ground between ourselves and it. It was as if the hearthrug were slowly humping itself into the form of an animal of some kind. It rose and rose without a sound. Soon it was larger than any dog, and its movement had somehow an uncanny suggestion of deliberate and malign purpose. Its bulk and outline, so far as we could make them out, suggested a bear more than anything else, but the head was not shaped like that of a bear. There was something more than half-human about the outline, which made it peculiarly horrible. There seemed to be a nose not in the least like the snout of any animal. Presently no vestige of the fire was to be seen. Then it suddenly reappeared. The creature, whatever it was, had gone up the chimney. We felt that the longer we waited there, the less we should like it, so as soon as the coast was clear, we ran down the room as hard as we could go, keeping as close as possible to the side away from the fireplace. There was plenty of firelight in the drawing room, and we soon laid hands on our candles and made our way upstairs. Our bedrooms opened into each other, and we left the door standing wide. I do not think either of us slept well, but there was nothing to disturb us except the owls, who, we both thought, were noisier than usual. Next day we told our story to the rest of the family, and I added what I had to say about the mysterious draught and my dream. Of course, there was only one thing to be done. The whole thing must be laid before Captain Moore as soon as possible. Meanwhile, the doors of the dining room must be kept locked and meals served in another room, which a house agent would probably have called the breakfast parlour. I was obliged to return to England on the following day, so it was some weeks before I heard the sequel. In response to an urgent if guarded letter, Captain Moore came over from the Curragh as soon as he could get a few days' leave. He soon knew all that there was to tell. His first step was to pay a visit to the lodge, but unfortunately the day before his arrival Barton had had a stroke from which he never recovered. He seemed to recognise his master and to be glad to see him, but he was in no state to be questioned. He died that night. Next day his daughter, who lived with him, told us that after Captain Moore's visit her father seemed to have something on his mind. Just after midnight he sat up and made an effort to say something. The only words she could make out sounded like trouble and back of the picture. Immediately afterwards he fell back on his pillow and expired. This was something to go upon. The queer portrait must be meant. A step-ladder was procured, and Captain Moore and my cousins set to work. It took them longer than they had expected, as the picture was not hung in the usual way. A number of long screws had been driven through the frame, which was very solid, into the panelling of the wall behind. At last they were all got out, not without difficulty, though they did not seem to be particularly rusty. The immediate result was disappointing. There was nothing to be seen either on the back of the picture or the surface of the wall. Then somebody noticed what looked like a fine crack running across the top of one panel just below the raised frame containing it. Close examination showed that the wood had been cut through on all four sides with a very sharp knife. A little picking at the top and out it came, disclosing a cavity, obviously the work of an amateur mason, in the thickness of the wall. In it reposed a small book about 9 inches long by 5 broad. At the top of the title page were the 2 words, "The Club," and underneath was a list of 12 names, presumably those of the members. Several of them belonged to families still represented in the neighbourhood. The last was Robert Moore, Captain Moore's great-grandfather. By this time lunch was ready, so further research was postponed. When the party returned reinvigorated to their task, they discovered, as was not unexpected, that what they had found was an informal minute book. It was apparently the custom of the club to dine once each month with one of the members and discuss topics of general interest. The first dinner was held on July 14th, 1778. There were notes as to the amount of wine consumed which need not be recorded here. One would imagine that the members of the club must have acted on the principle which was adopted subsequently by Mr. Jorrocks. Where I dines I sleeps, and where I sleeps I breakfast. There were also notes of the discussions. These were more interesting. At first they were principally political. The recent revolt of the American colonies appeared more than once, and though no formal vote was ever taken, it was obvious that opinion was divided as to the character of George Washington. Some members regarded him as a high-minded patriot, others as a sordid tobacco planter who did not want to make any contribution to the cost of the campaigns to which he and his like owed their security and prosperity. The revolution in France also aroused much interest. General opinion seemed to have been more favourable to it than most people, at any rate in England, would have approved. But the members of the club were probably all young enough to feel it their duty as well as their pleasure to ventilate opinions, which would have shocked their elders could they have heard them. As time went on, the tone of the meetings became less innocent. A certain amount of profanity began to appear, and once or twice some rather vague entries suggested some dabbling in black magic. At one dinner, held in the year 1797, there was a note. The President's health was drunk in bumpers, with probably acclamation. But the fact that the writer had changed his mind more than once as to the proper spelling of the word, added to 2 considerable blots, had made it indecipherable. On the next page was a plan of the table with the name of each member against his place. There were 6 on each side, no one at top or bottom. The top was, however, marked with a X. From this time onwards there were frequent references to the President, but curiously his name was never given. The minutes were usually initialed J.B. James Butler was the first name in the original list, so was presumably that of the senior member. It was not, however, clear whether he was to be identified with the President. Near the end of the book was an entry in a different hand. It ran, "The club is dissolved, Lord have mercy upon us." It was signed Robert Moore and dated September the 23rd, 1799. My odd experiences had culminated on September the 23rd, 1899. There was nothing else in the cavity in the wall except 2 small scraps of paper. They had obviously been part of a larger sheet which had been torn up. What had become of the rest it was impossible to say. On one appeared the words "like a bear," on the other "clean broke." That was all. Despite his ancestors' wishes, Captain Moore felt justified in destroying the portrait. It was soon hacked to pieces, and the bonfire which it made in the garden consumed the minute book of the club as well. The panel was replaced and another picture hung over it. As far as I know, there were no further disturbances. Perhaps a century is a kind of statute of limitations in such matters. We do not understand them sufficiently to be able to speak positively about them. It seems pretty clear that at its last meeting the club somehow got more than it had bargained for. But it is impossible to reconstruct exactly what had happened. Who was the President, and was the last meeting the first at which he was actually present? Was the queer portrait, which was presumably Robert Moore's work, intended to operate as a warning, like the public executions which were then in vogue? Some years afterwards I happened to find myself sitting next to an Irish clergyman at a public dinner. He was incumbent of a parish near Dublin, he told me. As the evening wore on and the tide of speech-making flowed strongly, our talk in the intervals turned on superstitions. "It's queer," he said, "the way they lay hold of people for no reason that anyone can see. Now there is one grave in my churchyard that the people won't go near, and when we turn in sheep to keep the grass down, the farmer always sends a boy to see that they don't graze by it. It's a nuisance because we always have to scythe that bit, and the sexton doesn't like doing it either. It's an ugly, pompous thing to a member of a family that used to be well known there, I believe, though there's not been any of them about these 50 years. but why there should be anything unlucky or wrong about it, I don't know. I'm not sure that the people do. Anyhow, if they do, you won't get it out of them. I wonder, I said, whether the occupant is named James Butler, and whether he died on September the 23rd, 1799. Why, yes, he said, but how in the world do you know anything about it? Oh, I used to have relations with whom I sometimes stayed in that neighbourhood. I thought that was as much as I need tell him. The end. That was The Dining-Room Fireplace by R.H. Malden. Malden had a particular gift for taking something entirely ordinary, a room, a piece of furniture, an architectural detail, and investing it with an almost unbearable sense of hidden history. In the Jamesian tradition, the horror lies not simply in what is seen, but in the growing realization that the past is never truly dead, and that places can sometimes remember far more than people. I hope you enjoyed this journey into one of the lesser-known corners of classic supernatural fiction. If you did, please consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, and sharing the video with fellow lovers of traditional ghost stories. Thank you as always for listening. Until next time, keep the fire burning brightly, and perhaps don't look too closely into the shadows beyond its glow. Good night. For several years I've devoted myself to creating original ghost stories, strange tales, atmospheric narrations, and supernatural fiction through haunted tales of darkness. What many people perhaps do not realize is the amount of work involved behind the scenes. The writing, editing, research, recording, artwork, publishing, and production that goes into trying to create something worthy of the great tradition of classic supernatural storytelling. I continue to do it because I genuinely love the work. Some months ago, however, YouTube effectively removed my ability to earn revenue from the channel, claiming that my content was somehow inauthentic. I was far from alone in this, as many other readers, writers, and narration channels were similarly affected. Ironically, this has happened at a time when the platform itself is increasingly flooded with AI-generated material. Part of the issue, I suspect, is that YouTube strongly favors midstream advertising, which is completely at odds with the kind of immersive storytelling experience I try to create. Interrupting a ghost story midway through with loud advertising breaks the atmosphere and destroys the flow for both reader and listener alike. A number of people have asked whether there is another way to support the channel and my writing directly, and that would be by supporting me through Patreon for anyone who wishes to help support future stories, books, narrations, and projects. There is absolutely no obligation, of course. Watching, listening, commenting, and sharing the work already helps enormously. But for those who would like to contribute monthly or simply leave the occasional gift of support, it would be deeply appreciated and would directly help me continue creating new material. Thank you to everyone who has followed and supported Haunted Tales of Darkness over the years.